A soldier poured sand into her weapon before the inspection. The general watched her strip it clean. The sand hit the barrel before anyone understood what she was doing. It hissed down into the receiver like something alive, and for one terrible second, 300 soldiers standing in formation forgot how to breathe. Sergeant R. Martinez had just poured a fistful of grit into her own rifle, in front of a general who had flown 1,100 miles to watch this exact inspection. And she had done it on purpose. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing who's listening. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The morning sun sat high and unforgiving over the parade ground, throwing hard shadows across rows of camouflage and polished boots. General Alden Whitcomb stood beneath the shade of the equipment shed, arms folded, ribbons catching the light on his dress blues. He had seen 30 years of soldiers try to impress him. He had never seen one deliberately sabotage her own weapon in front of him. Martinez didn't look up. Her hands were steady, which was strange, because her heart was not. She could feel 300 pairs of eyes drilling into the back of her neck, could feel the weight of every whispered question rippling through the ranks behind her. What is she doing? Has she lost her mind? Is this some kind of protest? She heard none of the words, but she felt their shape in the air, the way you feel a storm before the first drop of rain. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stood across the table from her. Canteen tilted, sand still trickling from his palm into the open action of the disassembled rifle. He was in on it. That much was clear to anyone paying close attention. The way his jaw was set, the way he didn't flinch when the general's gaze swung toward him like a searchlight. But knowing what was coming and trusting it would land were two very different things, and even Harrison's knuckles had gone pale around the canteen. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had existed. Martinez had been a name on a roster, a soldier with a good record and a reputation for showing up early and leaving late. She had transferred into the unit quietly, the way people do when they don't want their past following them through the door. She'd spent 4 years as an armorer at a forward operating base where sandstorms could bury a checkpoint in 20 minutes, where weapons jammed not from neglect but from an environment that seemed engineered to defeat them. She had learned, in that place, a lesson most soldiers stationed stateside never had reason to learn. A rifle is only as reliable as the soldier who can bring it back from the dead. She thought she'd left that lesson behind when she came home. She was wrong. It started with a rumor, the kind that moves through a barracks faster than any official memo. Word came down that this year's readiness inspection wouldn't just check for clean chambers and squared-away lockers. General Whitcomb, famous for his zero-tolerance stance on complacency, wanted something different. He wanted to see soldiers who could perform under pressure, not just soldiers who could shine brass. Harrison, who had served under Whitcomb once before in a different life in a different war, understood exactly what that meant. And he had exactly one soldier in his command who could deliver it. He'd found Martinez in the armory 2 nights before the inspection, elbow deep in a disassembled M4, and asked her a question that wasn't really a question. How fast can you clear a fouled weapon under a time hack, in front of people who are watching you fail? She'd looked at him for a long moment, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and said the only thing that felt true: faster than they think. There was a risk in that answer, and both of them knew it. If this went wrong, if the sand jammed something it shouldn't, if her hands slipped, if 30 seconds turned into 3 minutes, it wouldn't just embarrass her. It would embarrass Harrison, who had vouched for her, who had built his own credibility around this one unscheduled moment of theater in front of a man who did not forgive wasted time. Martinez had almost said no. She had a career that was finally stable, a reputation she'd rebuilt one early morning at a time, and here was a lieutenant colonel asking her to gamble all of it on a party trick with real ammunition components and a live audience. But she thought about the desert. She thought about the checkpoint at 0400, sand grinding into every seam of every rifle in her platoon, and the young corporal beside her whose weapon had locked up solid in the middle of a firefight because nobody had taught him what she was about to demonstrate now. She thought about how many of the soldiers standing in formation behind her had never once seen what happens when the environment turns against you, and how much safer they'd be if they did. So she said yes. And now here she was, sand raining down over black metal, the general's eyes fixed on her hands, and every soldier on that field holding a breath they didn't know they were holding. The grit settled into the bolt carrier group with a soft, dry whisper, coating the rails, packing into the firing pin channel, doing exactly what sand does best, finding every gap that matters. Harrison lowered the canteen. He gave her the smallest nod, barely emotion at all, and stepped back. Martinez's hand moved. What happened over the next 90 seconds would be talked about in that unit for years. She broke the weapon down with a rhythm that looked less like mechanical procedure and more like music. Upper receiver separated from lower with a practiced twist, charging handle drawn back and pulled free in one motion. Bolt carrier group extracted and inverted, sand pouring back out onto the table in a small, defeated cascade. Her fingers found the firing pin, retaining pin without looking, popped it free, and the firing pin slid loose, clean of grit in seconds. She wiped the bolt against her sleeve, not out of neatness but out of necessity, clearing the channel with quick, certain strokes. Somewhere behind her, a soldier murmured something to the man next to him, and the murmur spread, a current moving through the formation like wind through wheat. The general did not move. His arms stayed folded. But his eyes had narrowed, tracking every motion, cataloging what he was seeing the way he'd cataloged 1,000 soldiers before her and found most of them wanting. This was the moment the entire gamble balanced on. If she rushed, if fear made her hands unsteady, if the reassembly caught even half a second of hesitation, the story of this day would not be about competence. It would be about a soldier who tried to impress a general and failed in front of everyone who would ever serve under her again. Harrison understood this. He stood very still, watching her hands instead of watching Whitcomb's face, because he could not bear to see doubt arrive there before the ending had a chance to prove itself. Martinez felt none of that weight anymore. Something had happened in the middle of the disassembly, a shift that happens to people who have done something enough times that fear stops being useful and simply falls away. She was not performing for a general. She was back at that checkpoint, teaching a scared corporal how to save his own life with sand in his eyes and mortar fire somewhere over the ridge. Her hands knew this. Her hands had always known this. She reassembled the bolt carrier group with the same certainty, seated it back into the upper receiver, slid the charging handle home, locked the upper against the lower with a solid, decisive click that seemed to echo across the entire parade ground. She racked the charging handle once, checked the chamber, and set the weapon down on the table in front of her. Total time, 58 seconds. For a long moment, nobody clapped. Nobody breathed. The silence stretched thin enough that Martinez could hear her own pulse in her ears, and for the first time since she'd poured that first handful of sand, she felt the cold edge of doubt creep in. Maybe this hadn't been the lesson Harrison thought it was. Maybe a general who valued discipline above all else would only see recklessness in what she'd just done. A soldier playing games with a weapon system instead of respecting it. General Whitcomb stepped forward. He picked up the rifle himself, turned it over once in his hands, checked the action, checked the bore. Then he looked at Martinez, and something in his weathered face had changed. Some old, guarded thing loosening just slightly at the corners. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Not a challenge. A genuine question. "Sir," Martinez said, "I learned it somewhere that didn't give me a choice." The general held her gaze a moment longer, and then he did something none of the assembled soldiers expected. He turned toward the formation, held the weapon up, and told them, not asked them, told them, that what they had just watched was the difference between a soldier who owns their equipment and one who merely carries it. That readiness wasn't measured in shined boots. It was measured in what a person could still do when everything had gone wrong. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, obligatory kind. It rolled through the ranks like something set loose, and somewhere in the middle of it, Martinez caught Harrison's eye, and he gave her the kind of small, relieved smile that only passes between two people who have just survived the same risk together. There is a version of this story where Martinez never says yes to Harrison's question in the armory, where she protects the quiet stability she'd built and lets someone else carry the risk. Nobody would have blamed her for that. But courage rarely announces itself as courage in the moment. It usually just looks like someone deciding that a lesson worth teaching is worth the danger of teaching it badly. Because kindness doesn't vanish. It waits, and it finds its way back. And sometimes it comes back covered in sand. in the hands of a soldier who once needed someone to teach her exactly what she taught 300 strangers on an ordinary morning that stopped being ordinary the moment she trusted her own hands more than her fear. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments what part hit hardest. And if you believe steady hands can carry someone else's courage too, subscribe and stay with us. There's another story waiting, and it's better shared.